Katyn Massacre. The Katyn Massacre was one of the darkest events of World War II, and for decades, it was also one of the most heavily covered up. In 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union invaded Poland and split the country between them. About 125,000 Polish soldiers, policemen, and officials were captured by the Soviets, and they were sent to special camps such as Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov, where the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, interrogated them. Many of them were educated people such as doctors, lawyers, professors, etc., because Polish law required university graduates to serve as reserve officers. Then, on March 5, 1940, Stalin and the Soviet leadership secretly ordered the execution of nearly 22,000 of these prisoners. The goal was to wipe out Poland's leadership and educated class, making it harder for the country to ever regain independence. Between April and May 1940, NKVD squads carried out the killings. Prisoners were shot one by one, usually in the back of the head, and buried in mass graves. In 1943, German forces occupying the Smolensk region found the graves at Katyn and announced the discovery. The Polish government in exile asked for an international investigation, but Stalin broke off relations with them and claimed the Germans had carried out the killings in 1941. From then on, the Soviet Union pushed the lie that Katyn was a Nazi crime. Western governments, needing Stalin's cooperation during the war, avoided challenging him openly, even though British and American officials privately suspected or knew the truth. The cover-up lasted until 1990, when Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev finally admitted responsibility and released secret documents showing that Stalin and his top officials had signed the order. Later, Boris Yeltsin released more files, including proof that Soviet leaders had destroyed evidence in the 1950s. Still, not all records have been made public, and Russia has refused to call the massacre a genocide. Ford Pinto scandal. On May 28, 1972, Mrs. Gray was driving with 13-year-old Richard Grimshaw in their new Ford Pinto. The car had only been on the road for 6 months, but already had problems. While traveling from Anaheim to Barstow, they were hit from behind by a Ford Galaxy going about 30 miles per hour after braking. The crash caused the Pinto's fuel tank to rupture, and the car burst into flames. Mrs. Gray died a few days later from her injuries, and Richard suffered severe burns that required many surgeries and skin grafts. In court, experts explained that the rear impact pushed the fuel tank forward, where bolts punctured it. Gasoline then sprayed into the car and ignited. After a 6-month trial, the jury found Ford responsible. Then, a few years later, Ford faced another trial after 3 teenagers in Indiana died when their Pinto was rear-ended by a van and exploded. This time, Ford was charged with reckless homicide. The company was not convicted, but the fact that a major corporation stood trial for homicide was seen as historic in holding companies accountable. In reality, Ford decided not to change the Pinto's design, even though crash tests had shown the fuel tank could rupture in rear-end collisions over 30 miles per hour. Engineers knew the problem could be fixed, such as by adding a rubber bladder to the tank at a cost of about $11 per car, but management rejected the change after a cost-benefit study concluded it was cheaper to pay legal damages than to redesign the car. The study calculated that preventing 180 burn deaths, 180 serious injuries, and 2,100 destroyed cars would save about $49.5 million, while fixing all 11 million cars and 1.5 million trucks would cost $137 million. This decision came to light in 1977, when journalist Mark Dowie published his article, Pinto Madness. During the Grimshaw trial, former Ford executive Harley Kopp testified that he had raised safety concerns but was forced into early retirement. His testimony, along with internal documents like the Grush and Sonby memo, showed how Ford knowingly put a dangerous car on the market. The jury awarded $125 million in punitive damages, slightly more than the $124 million Ford had made in Pinto profits up to that point. Blood money scandal. The blood money scandal was one of the worst medical disasters of the late 20th century, affecting tens of thousands of people around the world. Hemophilia A is a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. To treat it, patients were given injections of factor VIII, a clotting protein made from donated human plasma. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, before HIV and hepatitis C were fully understood or tested for, much of this plasma came from high-risk groups such as prisoners, drug users, and men who had sex with other men. Plasma from thousands of donors was pooled together, which meant that if even one person carried a virus, the whole batch could be contaminated. By 1982, doctors noticed that some hemophiliacs were developing a strange immune deficiency, which was soon identified as AIDS. Then, in January 1983, an internal letter at Bayer's Cutter Biological Division admitted there was strong evidence that AIDS could be spread through plasma products. By March, the CDC publicly warned that clotting factors seemed to be responsible for AIDS among hemophiliacs. For this exact reason, some other companies started making heat-treated factor 8 that could kill viruses. However, despite knowing the risks, Bayer and other companies kept selling the untreated medicine for months, and in some cases, years. Cutter was the last of the major firms to get U.S. approval for its heat-treated product in February 1984. By 1985, the old untreated product could no longer be sold in Western countries, so companies began selling it in Asia and Latin America instead. Later documents showed that Cutter told foreign distributors to use up stocks of the unsafe product before moving to the safer version, while publicly insisting it was not dangerous. Soon after, hemophiliacs in places like Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Latin America started testing positive for HIV. The damage was enormous. In the US, between 6,000 and 10,000 hemophiliacs were infected with HIV and thousands more with hepatitis C. In total, tens of thousands of hemophiliacs worldwide contracted life-threatening infections. Governments and courts all over the world later launched inquiries and trials. In the US, for example, 4 companies agreed to pay $660 million to more than 6,000 victims. One US health advocate later said that the internal documents were the most incriminating he had ever seen. Downing Street Memos. In July 2002, senior members of the British government met at 10 Downing Street to talk about Iraq. A memo from that meeting, written by Matthew Rycroft, caused a huge scandal. It recorded what the head of MI6 reported after visiting Washington. He said that President George W. Bush had already decided to remove Saddam Hussein by force, and that the reason for war would be built by linking terrorism to weapons of mass destruction. The most scandalous part was that Dearlove said that the intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy. Foreign Secretary Jack Straw admitted the reasons for war were weak. He said Saddam still had some weapon capabilities, but his power was smaller than countries like Libya, Iran, or North Korea, and he was not threatening nearby nations. Attorney General Lord Goldsmith warned that invasion had no clear legal basis, since international law did not allow regime change on its own. One idea they talked about was to demand that Iraq let UN inspectors back in. If Saddam refused, it could give them political and legal cover to start a war. The memo also showed that U.S. forces had already started small attacks months before Congress officially voted on war, called spikes of activity, against Iraq to put pressure on the regime. While all of these decisions were being made in private, they said to the public that no final decision had yet been made. The document was leaked to journalist Michael Smith and published in the Sunday Times in May 2005, 2 years after the end of the war. Its release, just before UK elections, caused a storm in Britain. In the US, major media at first ignored it, but it spread quickly on blogs and later entered congressional debate. Congressman John Conyers and more than 100 other members of Congress demanded answers from the Bush administration. The White House and Tony Blair denied doing anything wrong. Bush just said it was not true that he had already decided on war in July 2002, and Blair said the intelligence was not fixed. British officials admitted the memo was real, but argued it did not show anything new. Tobacco industry's cover-up. In the early 1950s, the tobacco industry faced a crisis it had never seen before. While no one thought smoking would have been dangerous before, they actually thought it was healthy, more and more scientific studies showed that it caused lung cancer and other deadly diseases. For the first time, the survival of the industry was in danger. So in December 1953, the heads of the largest tobacco companies met at New York's Plaza Hotel to decide on what to do. They hired John Hill, head of the public relations firm Hill & Knowlton, who told them that denying the science would not work. Instead, the industry should look like it supported science, while quietly undermining the findings. The key idea was that if the public believed the science was uncertain, people would keep smoking. In January 1954, the companies launched a massive newspaper ad campaign called A Frank Statement. It said the industry cared about public health, promised more research, and claimed there was no proof that smoking caused cancer. This was the start of what became known as the Tobacco Playbook. An internal R.J. Reynolds memo later summed it up pretty well. He said, "Doubt is our product." To create that doubt, the companies set up the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, or TIRC. It looked like an independent research committee, but was actually controlled by the industry. The TIRC paid for research that ignored the dangers of smoking, brought in scientists who doubted the smoking cancer link, and promoted studies that made the industry look good. Then, they also targeted the media. Hill and Knowlton gave reporters lists of independent experts to quote, which made it look like a real debate was still going on. Many journalists, wanting to show both sides, treated the scientific consensus and the industry's claims as if they were equally valid. This misled the public into thinking the dangers of smoking were still uncertain, even though the evidence was already strong. Tobacco companies also used lobbying to block regulations, and they created fake movements that promoted the idea that smoking was an individual choice and that there shouldn't be regulations on it. The strategy worked. For decades, smoking rates stayed high, regulations were delayed, and millions kept smoking despite the evidence. This success made it so the strategy was used by other industries as well, such as the fossil fuel one to question climate science, the soft drinks industry, etc. Panama Papers. The Panama Papers were one of the biggest leaks in history. On April 3, 2016, more than 11.5 million documents came out, all from the Panamanian law firm Mossack Fonseca, which made its business out of setting up and running offshore companies. Having one of these offshore companies isn't always illegal, but the papers showed that many were actually used for fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, or to dodge international sanctions. The leak named 12 heads of state, 128 other politicians and public officials, and plenty of billionaires, athletes, and even criminals. Some cases showed straight-up corruption, like money from drug cartels, while others exposed conflicts of interest. Iceland's Prime Minister Sigmundur David Gunnlaugsson, for example, resigned after it came out that he and his wife secretly owned a company tied to Iceland's failed banks. Relatives of powerful leaders like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping also showed up in the files. In total, about $2 trillion is thought to have moved through Mossack Fonseca's network. The reaction was worldwide. In the UK, Prime Minister David Cameron faced heavy criticism after admitting his family had benefited from offshore holdings. Governments from Australia to Colombia opened investigations, and by 2019, more than $1.2 billion had been recovered. Back in Panama, the government denied being a tax haven and set up a review commission led by Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, but he later quit after Panama refused to guarantee transparency. Mossack Fonseca said it had been hacked and denied breaking any laws, but its reputation never recovered, so by 2018, the firm had shut down for good. Alfred Redl's treason. Alfred Redl was one of the highest intelligence officers in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his job was to stop Russian spies and feed them false information. The problem was that, in reality, he was secretly working for Russia. From 1903 onward, he gave them basically everything he knew. He also betrayed his own spies, sending them into Russia only to reveal them. This went on until 1909, when the British ambassador in Russia warned Austria that there was a spy inside its staff. The Austrian ambassador passed on the warning, but the report went straight to the head of counterintelligence, who was, funnily enough, Redl himself. He managed to turn the blame back onto the ambassador, humiliating him and keeping his own secret safe. In 1913, Redl's replacement, Maximilian Rong, introduced stricter checks on suspicious mail. This uncovered a package full of money meant for a Russian spy, and when investigators followed the trail, it led them directly to Redl. He confessed and was given a revolver, with which he killed himself. At that point, the Austro-Hungarian military had an important choice to make. Redl had already given away all their most important secrets, but admitting this would mean accepting that their war plans were useless and that Russia already knew everything. Instead, they chose to cover it up. They told the public and even their own soldiers that Redl had not revealed anything important. When World War I started a year later, Austria went into battle with war plans that the enemy already had. Their armies suffered heavy defeats against both Serbia and Russia in the first years of the war. This means that the decision to hide Redl's treason instead of confronting it may have cost up to 1 million lives. The Dreyfus Affair. The Dreyfus Affair was one of the most famous political scandals in French history, and it divided the country for more than 10 years. It began in 1894, when Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish artillery officer from Alsace, was accused of giving military secrets to Germany. The main evidence was a handwritten note called the bordereau, found at the German embassy in Paris. Handwriting experts claimed it matched Dreyfus's writing, but their analysis was flawed, and other evidence was weak or even made up. Still, Dreyfus was convicted of treason. He was stripped of his rank in a humiliating public ceremony and sent to life imprisonment on Devil's Island in French Guiana, where he spent 5 years in brutal isolation. Then, in 1896, Lieutenant Colonel Georges Picard, the new head of counter-espionage, discovered that the real traitor was another officer, Ferdinand Walsin Esterhazy. Esterhazy's handwriting clearly matched the bordereau. However, instead of clearing Dreyfus, army leaders covered it up. Esterhazy was put on trial but quickly acquitted, while Picard was punished for speaking out. Public opinion exploded in 1898 when the writer Émile Zola published his famous open letter, J'accuse, on the front page of L'Aurore. In it, he accused the army and the government of framing Dreyfus and covering up the truth. Zola was convicted of libel and fled into exile, but his article gave strength to the Dreyfusards, who demanded justice. Meanwhile, anti-Dreyfusards, often nationalists and anti-Semitic groups, insisted Dreyfus was guilty. France became divided, and riots broke out. In 1899, Dreyfus was brought back from Devil's Island for a retrial, but the military court once again found him guilty, this time with extenuating circumstances, and sentenced him to 10 more years. The injustice was so clear that he was soon pardoned by the president. It took until 1906 for the French Supreme Court to clear him completely, cancel his convictions, and reinstate him in the army. Dreyfus later served with honor in World War I, rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel. Teapot Dome Scandal. The Teapot Dome scandal was one of the most famous cases of political corruption in U.S. history. It happened during the presidency of Warren G. Harding and involved his Secretary of the Interior, Albert B. Fall. In 1921, control of several naval oil reserves was moved from the Navy to the Interior Department. Then, coincidentally, Fall secretly leased these reserves to private oil companies on suspiciously really good terms, without any open bidding. If you couldn't guess by now, Fall accepted large personal payments in return. The leases themselves were legal, but for example, one of the buyers gave Fall a $100,000 interest-free loan. His sudden wealth raised suspicions, especially because he was once deeply in debt, while now he was paying off loans, fixing up his ranch, and living much more comfortably. The scandal began to surface after a small oil operator in Wyoming complained to his senator about the secret deal. This led Congress to investigate in 1922, but for 2 years the investigation struggled, as evidence disappeared, and Fall tried to hide his tracks. Eventually, though, they uncovered proof of the $100,000 payment, which blew the case open. The Supreme Court later ruled that the oil leases had been corruptly obtained and canceled them, returning the reserves to the Navy. In 1929, Fall was convicted of taking bribes, becoming the first U.S. cabinet member ever sent to prison. President Harding died in 1923, before the full scandal became public, but his reputation was permanently damaged. All of this led to huge changes. It strengthened Congress's power to force testimony, gave lawmakers access to tax records, and created stricter rules for campaign financing. ExxonMobil and climate change. From the 1970s onward, Exxon and later ExxonMobil heavily studied climate change, and in 1977, the company's scientists warned that burning oil, gas, and coal was likely causing global warming. Then, by the early 1980s, Exxon's own report said climate change could be catastrophic and possibly permanent if fossil fuel use was not reduced, but nevertheless, the company changed how it spoke in public. It began to say that climate science was uncertain, and it gave money to groups and campaigns that spread doubt. From 1998 to 2004, it spent at least $16 million on organizations that denied or questioned global warming. And for decades, it also paid for weekly ads in U.S. newspapers that claimed the science was unsettled. The Union of Concerned Scientists intervened, saying that Exxon's actions were similar to how the tobacco industry once denied the dangers of smoking. Exxon became one of the strongest opponents of rules to cut emissions, also helping block U.S. approval of the Kyoto Protocol, an international climate treaty. Finally, from the mid-2000s, ExxonMobil started to change its public message, saying that it would stop funding some denial groups, and in 2006, it admitted that burning fossil fuels contributes to climate change. Lastly, in 2015, it said it supported a carbon tax. If you liked this video, subscribe for similar ones or join my Discord to suggest another.